We're going to start on the legislative branch today. We're going to read Article 1, or I'm going to read Article 1, try and annotate it a bit. We're concerned more with certain parts of Article 1 than others. Some of them are pretty obvious and need no further explanation. You can read them, so I'll probably jump over those, and you can take a look at those later. Pretty much all of of sections 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and all the way up to the second part of this, which I consider to be starting in Section 8. Section 8 is where all they lay out, pretty much the founders do, all the powers that we're most concerned with in terms of understanding the legislative branch. So Section 8, Section 1, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, but all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. This is an important power. You're going to see it gets very expansive, it gets very vague. We don't really we can't limit specifically what they're talking about in terms of the limitation of those powers. What does it mean to say the welfare of the United States? That's really decided by Congress, and as we know, that's very expansive. There's not really much of a limitation on that. To borrow money on the credit of the United States, we know that for the most part we've got a great deal of debt in the United States. A lot of that debt is really owed to U.S. citizens. It's not, as many suspect, all foreign nations and the like. It is U.S. citizens that hold a great amount of that, majority of that. The next part is really important. To regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. This is important because the Commerce Clause, the taxing and spending clauses, are the most important clauses in Article 1 because they're the most expansive powers and they're the one that affect people arguably to the greatest extent. So the next is 4, which is the establishment of basically a uniform rule of naturalization, uniform laws on the subject of bankruptcies throughout the United States. Sorry, it's bankruptcies. There again, nothing of great importance in terms of what most people are going to experience. To coin money, regulate the value thereof in foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. The weights and measures not so important, but I would like to talk about this idea of to coin money and regulate the value thereof. What was not really envisioned here was the idea that there'd be a Federal Reserve. That's not mentioned here at all. And consequently, it's complicated, this whole thing, to a great extent. So for the most part, we're not really going to talk about the Federal Reserve. That's something for another class. But be aware of the fact that this idea of coining money and regulating the value, that there's a partnership with a semi-quasi-government agency called the Federal Reserve. Agency is probably not the best word there, but the Federal Reserve is an institution outside the actual, federal government, and goes back to the early, 1920s and the like. So we're not going to concern ourselves too much with that, or the establishment of post offices and post roads. There again, not really very significant in terms of what we're interested in looking at. We don't really necessarily want to focus on post offices. 8 is to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. This is basically copyrights and patents. Again, it's not an area that we're really going to focus on. If you go to law school and you decide that patent's really something that interests you, you can really focus on those. We're not going to do that here. The next part, to constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. If you remember from when we talked about the judiciary, that the appellate jurisdiction and the lower courts were all under the control of Congress. that the original jurisdiction of the court was not under the control of Congress or the executive branch. If you want to change that, it takes you're really changing the Constitution. You're really changing the particulars, and that would mean some other additional amendment or the like, unless there's some legislative maneuvering that goes on there. But that's not likely. All right, to define and punish piracies and felonies committed in the high seas and offenses against the law of nations. Not something we're going to focus on, vague. Now, the next part, to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules governing captures on land and water. You can understand at this time why that might have been important. It's less important now because we don't necessarily worry about capturing, vessels on the open seas and the like. To raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be longer term than 2 years. That's not something we really deal with. It's gotten a lot more complicated in terms of war powers. Even though Congress gets to declare war, presidents don't really go to Congress. The War Powers Resolution was an attempt on the part of Congress to exert their authority over declarations of war. What constitutes a declaration of war? If the president sends in troops into a particular area to protect American interests or the like, even though we might consider that, other countries might consider it an act of war, presidents get to do this. And politically, Congress does not want to get behind and declare war unless it's so obvious that this is really something the nation wants and that it needs to be done. They don't. Why invest your political capital if you're in Congress on something that may not work out? Better to point to the president and tell the president that the president's should make those decisions. Again, it's not a declaration of war. Declaration of war also gets more complicated. All right, to provide and maintain a navy, to make rules for the government and regulation of land and naval forces. Not much of a focus here. To provide for calling forth the militia, to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. If you remember from the executive, Article 2 from our exploration of the executive really gets to do that. They're executing, again, those authorities. Congress tends to stay away from military action because it could not work out. And again, they don't want to invest their political capital. Exclusive legislation, all cases whatsoever over such district. This is a District of Columbia. Again, we're not really going to focus on that. And to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and other powers vested by this Constitution of the Government of the United States or in the Department or officers thereof. This is important. It's necessary and proper. So we got really 3 areas we're interested in: necessary and proper. There, the focus is what does that mean and what, if any, limitations are placed on it. The commerce power, which is very involved and takes a long time. It starts off as a very simple thing because commerce is a very simple thing, going back to when the nation was founded. And then it goes to taxing and spending. Again, we're not going to really touch on coinage and the like because of the Federal Reserve, and that's a much more complicated endeavor. So really what we focus on when we talk about the legislative branch are those things, necessary and proper, which is important in terms of figuring out what that means, because it's a very broad power. Anything that Congress thinks is necessary, right, or proper, they can go ahead and do, right? So making all laws that are necessary and proper for carrying out its enumerated powers. So in other words, think about when we talk about commerce, the commerce power, or taxing and spending. The laws that govern that are really tied to this idea of necessary and proper. Now, who decides what's necessary and proper? Congress does. In that way, the courts will really give deference to the Congress in those decisions. Presidents might push back, but their powers are limited in that way. They can only veto a particular piece of legislation. So necessary and proper really falls in the hands of the Congress itself. So who governs that? Well, typically we believe that the political will, right, the public, the people will, if they're dissatisfied or don't agree with that particular piece of legislation, that they could, vote them out in the next election. That's sort of, as I mentioned before, that's typically how we think about having, a check on the Congress, other than the federal courts can look at, the Supreme Court can look at actions Congress takes to make sure they're consistent with the Constitution. That doesn't mean that they're dealing with what's offensive to the public necessarily. The president, a little bit more tied to the public, nevertheless will veto things that maybe will curry favor with the president's constituents, but maybe not the majority of the population. So this idea that necessary and proper, has to be defined is important. These enumerated powers, again, are also vast in terms of their interpretation. If you remember, we talked about at the very beginning of the course that interpretation is important. What do various things mean in the Constitution? How do we specifically what they are? And it changes over time, those definitions, so it becomes much more complicated than one might imagine. So when we talk about necessary and proper, we're talking about things that are rationally related to the object being sought by the Congress or by government. Now, again, rationally related only means that you have to be able to demonstrate that what you're doing is related to what you hope to accomplish, and that what you hope to accomplish is necessary and proper. So there again, it's interpretive, but we'll go a little bit more into that later. So I want to talk just briefly about the concept of federalism. The thing about the United States, or about the way the government is structured, is we really have two separate systems of governance, right? We have state governance, and we have national governance, and that creates this system. So there should be, and was even to a greater extent, a tension between those two. States want to exert their rights and want to protect, their particular legislation and their structure in their states. And the federal government really wants to be able to impose theirs. So there's always this dance that's getting done. And you see when we get to commerce, that one of the mechanisms that sort of resolves that conflict is money. All states want federal money. And so, for example, the federal government says, raise the drinking age to 21, and we'll give you money for your roads. Now, what do roads have to do with the drinking age? Is it necessary and is it proper to do that? Well, does it matter if it's necessary or proper if the states who are going to be impacted by it agree to it? They don't have to agree, but the states want the money. So you'll see through commerce and through federal spending and taxing that they can control state action, rather than having what would, at the time of the founding, the expectation is that states had basically a superiority in terms of determining, exactly what they could or could not do over the federal government. In other words, at the beginning of this, we had state governments that had more authority than the federal government. That really changes at or after the Civil War, when it's clear that the federal government has a great deal of power. There you have a case where states wanted to from the Union, and the federal government said no, and basically went to war over it and pulled them back into the Union. That, to a large measure, really settled the issue of who has authority over whom. So basically, it's the focus of power shifted to the federal government, but the dance is still done today between the federal government and the states, because the states want that federal money. They also want federal support. Think about when the federal government sends in troops or what have you to a state. Let's say there's unrest. The governors have to request that. The states have to request it. Federal government just can't go in unless there's some sort of declaration of war or the like. You're not going to have a willingness on the part of the federal government, the president who would execute that law, right, would execute the request, acting on their own. Now, the president can go ahead and put troops in a state to protect federal institutions or structures. You have to understand that where there is a federal entity or a construct somewhere, that's under the control of the federal government. So, for example, if you look at bases, military bases, that land itself, that environment, those environments are under the control of the federal government, as are federal buildings throughout the country. So the president does not need, the state, government, the governor, the executive of the state, to request troops to protect federal institutions or federal property. That's completely under the control of the federal government. So there's no need for that request to be made. All right. So the idea of federalism then is important. It is set up in the Constitution that these two entities, the federal and the state governments, are going to be having to resolve issues together. Now, in the original, intent, in terms of the structure of things, the relationship between the states and the federal government, it was sort of understood that the federal government was a way of keeping these states united. That the idea was that the federal government would really address issues of conflict between the states and also against foreign enemies or the like. In other words, the idea here was that there was going to be conflict between the states, and if you're going to keep the union together in order to protect all the states from foreign entities, you were going to need some body and organization or government structure to deal with those conflicts. That's why under the original jurisdiction they don't get to change it, because the idea there is that the Congress can write their laws, but the states have to have a relationship between the federal government and those states, and no state can give a fair trial, if you will, when there's a conflict between one state and another. In other words, if New York has a conflict with New Jersey, where do you resolve that case? If you do it in a New York court, presumably New York has an advantage. If you do it in a Jersey court, presumably Jersey has the advantage. Do it in federal court, presumably no one has an advantage. So the value of the Constitution in terms of resolving conflict between states is an important one, because without that, you're going to have conflict. If you have conflict, the states don't remain as united, which means they can't protect themselves from outside challenges or what have you. You have to remember at the time of the founding, the United States, these states did not have many friends around the world. I mean, the English, the Spanish, the Dutch, all of those nations and more were waiting for the collapse of the United States to take control because of the vast resources here and the like. If you've taken American government, you're well familiar with that. All right. So basically, there are certain things that obviously the state can take that are valid under the Constitution and federal laws, but there are specific limitations that can be placed on it, as we've just mentioned. So I want to go over a few particulars here, and then we're going to look at those which are most important: commerce, taxing and spending, necessary and proper. All right. So you have to keep in mind this idea of general welfare, and being able to lay and collect taxes as part of that. I think we can all agree that the federal government spends money, tax dollars, in a way that, I think a lot of people would not necessarily be wholeheartedly behind. In other words, you're collecting taxes from American citizens, and let's say you're spending it in some other country because there's interest you're protecting there, United States interests. Okay, but how do we measure those interests? How much should we invest there? How do we measure if they are, in fact, those interests are actually being advanced properly? I'll give you an example. There are any number of agencies, or organizations, and for-profit organizations, not nonprofit, but for-profit. One area is that the Congress has decided that we should make some effort to create democracies in countries, right? Okay, and one way we might do that is to help these countries set up legislative bodies like, or at least close to, resembling the structure we have here in the United States. And so they'll pay vast sums of money to the U.S. government to have these for-profit companies go in and assess if, in fact, these countries are structuring, a system, a legislative body as such. Now, I know of a couple of instances, two different organizations, for-profits. They'll get the contract. They'll go in. They'll assess that, in fact, they've come together in this particular country and they've created a structure, but really they're not really executing anything. And so it's not exactly having its intended purpose. It is to an extent that they've developed a body, but a structure, but nothing's happening there. Typically, the Congress says, great, thank you very much for letting us know that, and here's your next contract. And then nothing is done about it, because really what can you do about it? But yet Congress can say that they're trying to bring democracy around the world. Now you could argue, is that really the job of the United States, right? And that ties into, American exceptionalism and all of that. But is that really something that our government should be undertaking with our dollars, our tax dollars? Should the government be borrowing so much money that there's so much debt that it may hurt the ability of the United States to compete in the world? I mean, these are really complex issues where there's not much agreement. There are two or three sides to the issue, typically, one pro, one con, and one that sees a piece of each that has to be sort of navigated. Nevertheless, we don't know. For example, the useful arts, spending money for the useful arts. What defines a useful art? So the government decides that they're going to give money to artists that want to, let's just say, make sculptures out of sand. That's what they've decided. Somehow that's important. And someone is doing that and receives federal support. Someone else may be involved in, let's say, creating great musical pieces. And the government says we're not going to support that. They can't complain, those that are creating the great musical pieces, to the courts that, hey, we're not getting any money, because the courts have been very clear on this. Once they collect those taxes, as you'll see when we talk about tax and spending, it's really up to the government to spend it the way they want to spend it, regardless of whether you approve of it or not. The idea, again, is if you don't like it, you can vote them out. Let me just touch on that for a second. This idea that democracy exists because the people have a will and they can exercise that will, not in revolution, but at the polling place. It hasn't really worked that way for, I think, a couple of reasons. One is that states and people in those states want different things. And there may not be, the will, a collective will, that clearly resides in one camp or the other. And so there's some confusion, or I should say at least there's some inconsistency between states and individuals and what they want. The second thing is that oftentimes, people elected to the federal government, to Congress, represent people, not necessarily directly, everything those people want, but they can sell it, and there is a limited ability of people to spend time, digging into a particular policy to really fully understand it. Congress can write policy that, is 5 pages or 500 pages. Who's going to cull through that to try and see actually what is in it and what it means? Because it has to be interpreted again. And states could take that piece of legislation that's been passed by Congress and the president, and agree to it without really knowing fully what its impact is going to be or what it means. So this idea, it's another facet of the necessary and proper. How do you, if you can't measure it, how do you know? If you can't get the public will behind it totally, and it's not clearly defined what that piece of legislation is and how it's going to be implemented and what its impact is going to be, it becomes more difficult to have the public will sort of rise up and go to the polling place and pull the lever, if you will, as a direct consequence of that particular issue. The political parties both speak in very vague terms. They don't, oftentimes, especially in presidential elections, we try and press them for exactly what they're going to do, what their platform is, and how they're going to do it. Politicians are very good at not answering that question. They'll be very vague. They'll say things that most people agree with. Who couldn't agree with, making our community stronger? Okay, how? Explain how you do that. But they don't, typically because they really can't. Something like that is very difficult to accomplish, but yet people agree on it. Yeah, strengthening communities and families is very good. Okay, well, how are you going to do that? Explain to us how you're going to do that. So it's not as simple as it's laid out. That basically you just go ahead and you let the people go to the polling place and they'll decide what they like and don't like. Most people don't understand the issues. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that people can't understand the issues. It's that the issues are presented in simple, easily graspable ways, but the nitty gritty, the devil's in the details, so to speak, and then how it gets executed. So Congress can mean a very specific thing, but then the president executes it and has to interpret it in their own way. Or the president could not veto it, but not really execute it, if you recall from previous lectures about the executive branch. So these specific powers that are really important is this idea of laying and collecting taxes, borrowing money, regulating commerce, a big one, and declaring war, which is no longer really a major issue in the military, but the necessary and proper clause. We have to really come to terms with that. And that's not so easy. Now, in foreign affairs, I just want to touch on this briefly. In foreign affairs, really that's the president. The nation needs to speak in one voice, if you recall those lectures. And so that being the case, it becomes a little bit more complicated for Congress to get involved. Congress controls the purse strings. They can say, we're not spending money on that. Remember, that's what they do. They have a right to, spending power. But really, even that, presidents can take money from elsewhere, and some of it is accepted or has been accepted. Other actions using that mechanism have been rejected. So, again, that's not really very, very clear. All right. And don't forget, we're still in the world of what is implied powers and what are very specific powers. So again, with necessary and proper, it's not as easy to get our minds around or for us to clearly define what necessary and proper might be. Also keep in mind that a policy that benefits a state or some states or a particular group of people, they may think it's necessary and proper, but others may think not so. So how does that work? How do you make the decision, or does Congress make the decision about benefiting some group or some states, but not all? Right? We can agree on things like if there's a natural disaster, that the government should send money to those places and help them out. I don't think anyone would say, we shouldn't help them. We shouldn't give money to the states and help them out there. A hurricane, a flood, whatever it may be. But other than that, giving money to the states or a particular state, it seems oftentimes that's what Congress is after, right? Bring home the bacon, so that basically their constituents, they can say, look what I brought home. Look, government money is coming here, creating jobs and so on and so forth. So a lot of what people think Congress should be doing is bringing home resources Um, there again, how do we measure those, and are they appropriate or not? Where you put a military base, for example, is very important. Military base creates a community around it. If you think about, all the things, if you put 1,000 even or 2,000, troops or in a particular area, they need things that can't be supplied on the base, right? Dry cleaning. Where do you get that? They might want to go out for pizza. Where do you get that? Right? They need to buy some clothes for their children. So the community around those bases, businesses crop up, and their major customers, if you will, are the military. And once you close that military base, all of those businesses no longer have that customer base, and they just wither away. And that means jobs, all those people that worked in all of those stores, you worked in the movie theater, and so on, those things close down. And as a consequence, people don't have jobs. The unemployment rate goes up in that particular state, and then Congress people have to deal with that. And so they'll fight. They'll fight over what bases stay open or don't. A while back in Connecticut, right, sub-base, in New London, they fought to keep that open. On Long Island, there was, out in Grumman, right, they decided to close that base, and everything withered away. So you can see the real impact of these things. So again, we talk about necessary and proper. It gets a little bit dicier than I think people would sort of wish to recognize, especially people in the legislative branch. And again, something that's appropriate and rationally related. What makes it rationally related? So again, look, law and those that are involved in creating it or executing it or judging it is about words. Words are stock and trade in legal circles. How you interpret the words means something. And I've mentioned this before. We talked about the judicial branch. They spend a lot of time trying to define words and their decisions and the like. What does this mean? Because you have to make decisions or execute it based on what was specifically meant when they wrote it. Legislators tend to write vague legislation and leave it up to the president or leave it up to the states to figure out what it is and shape it. And then for the courts to make a determination about what Congress meant and whether the execution of it is proper or not, consistent with that, which makes it proper. Okay, so there again, what you have, and I don't want to make it seem like Congress doesn't do anything, but Congress does have cover by what it passes along to the president, what it passes along to regulatory bodies that Congress creates to do the heavy lifting, or whether the Congress just waits to see if the courts will take it up because somebody will argue that what's been written is unconstitutional or what, and see what the court says. So in many ways, the meaning behind a piece of legislation is shaped by the president executing it and by the courts defining it. So think about that. You can be vague, and that gives you political coverage, and that's what Congress looks for. Again, I don't want to say it's completely that, but any congressperson, whether they're a representative or whether they're a senator, that ignores that does so at their own peril. You need to make sure that what you put in a piece of legislation, in fact, is going to be accepted by your constituents. Oftentimes, those in Congress, especially in the Senate, that are thinking of running for the presidency a year or so before, or sometimes their entire time there, will be very careful about what policies, what pieces of legislation they support, because that will come back and haunt them. In other words, their opponent will say that so-and-so, the person they're running against, supported a particular bill which devastated that community. So they're very careful. So sometimes they do nothing because to do something puts their political fortunes in jeopardy. So, the legislative body, which was given a great deal of, power and focus by the founders, has turned out more and more to rely on the other branches and the states to define what a piece of legislation is and means. And so making it more vague, leaving it open to interpretation, gives all those politicians, again, cover. And even presidents, they just talk in vague terms, and people would agree with it. And it's how you couch it, words, everything. So just think about the idea of pro-life or pro-choice. Who could be against either of those things? Right? Who wouldn't be pro-life or who would be pro-choice? It used to be abortion and anti-abortionists. That doesn't play very well with the public. But giving them a way of talking about it that accents the positive, if you will, that focuses on making whatever that particular policy approach more palatable is a good thing. So more and more different sides of an argument put their argument in terms that no one really would reject in terms of the words used to describe it: pro-life, pro-choice. Now, those things mean specific things, and people have objections to them on either side. But my point is that by labeling those things positively, it really serves, and to a large extent, it really serves advocating for that particular thing. Now, no one's fooled in the case of pro-choice or pro-life in terms of what those terms mean. No one's confused by those things because they do get spoken about in a way that's very clear and deals with what they actually mean. But nevertheless, you want to put a positive name to it. The Affordable Care Act. Who doesn't want affordable health care? Question is it that? Is it what kind of health care is it? Is it affordable? Affordable to whom? How does that work? I mean, it's a very nice name, right? It uses terms that we all would like: affordable, and healthcare, right? Health. Who could be against that? So words are really important, is what I'm trying to say here. And it does give cover to politicians when they speak about those things, to some extent. Excuse me. And of course, there's fear-mongering and all of that goes along with most policies. So you have to keep in mind, we talk about, Congress's behavior here, which is what we're doing in terms of what Congress does. To study Congress, to study legislation, when all of what I've just said is in play, and then you consider that there are lower courts and appellate courts to the Supreme Court that Congress can set up, and really the number of justices on the Supreme Court is not set. That they can change. So all of that's in the mix. And then when you think in terms of these regulatory bodies, that the court, by the way, the Supreme Court, gives a lot of deference to. They figure that these are specialists in that area. They understand it. And in some ways, they give more weight to regulatory agencies when they come in than they do to specific other organizations, because the regulatory bodies, this is what they specialize in. So they have a lot of leeway. So it's the regulatory bodies, it's the courts that have been set up. It's the avoidance of making policy decisions because of political fortunes may come into play. Again, I don't want to make it sound like Congress doesn't do anything, but I think Congress has probably, to a large extent, is got more tools for avoiding political fallout. And so that adds to the concept that you can always go to the polling place and you could sort of vote out the bums, right? That's the expression. Well, for the reasons I've just mentioned, that usually doesn't happen. The rate of people being reelected, right, and remaining in their seats for a long time in Congress is pretty high. It's not easy to remove, in the House, 40 seats, flip 40 seats. You're not going to do that. In the Senate, is only 100, so it doesn't take, as opposed to 435, it doesn't, in the House, it doesn't take, but a few seats to be flipped usually to swing the balance of power there. So there's probably maybe a 5, seat advantage, 6 maybe, that one of the other parties has in the controlling that chamber. For 2 reasons. One, they're not elected. The whole chamber is not elected every 2 years. So there are different classes, and those typically rotate. You get a third of the Senate basically up for re-election. So you have 2/3, that are not. And so, for there to be with 1/3 of the chamber running, so many seats flipped, you're talking about maybe 30 some odd seats flipped, not very likely. So there tends to be a consistency. Plus, the public has this idea that if you want to constrain the president, you need perhaps the House or the Senate or both of those chambers controlled by the other party, the out party, the one that doesn't control the White House, so they can place a check on the president. That's sort of the idea, rather than let one party control both houses of Congress and the presidency, because then they're fully responsible for all the policies that come out of the chamber or the White House, and then the public can hold them accountable. Another mechanism, right, is that it's through public action. Really, it's not likely that you're going to have that situation. And if you do, then you can say that one party is really in control of making all the decisions, because they can override the other parties because they have a majority. There's a school of thought that by giving it to one party, having one party run it, and therefore having a responsibility, that being a little bit more sensitive to the out party, so they can get some political coverage. That basically, a whole bunch of Democrats or a whole bunch of Republicans, also supported, this policy. So coverage might be getting the other party to agree and working together and giving, maybe more exacting policies, putting them in place. That's a reasonable assumption of what might happen, because everyone wants political coverage. And if your party's in control of everything, then your party's responsible for everything. Perhaps reaching out to the other party and getting buy-in gives you some coverage. It's sort of like term limits in some ways. People are back and forth on term limits. Should there be term limits? And there are arguments that there should be, that in the House, 2-year terms, maybe you can do that 3 times. You can run for re-election, and then you're term limited. You've got to give up the seat. There are arguments for that, and there are arguments against it. And I think in lots of ways those arguments depend more about or based more on human behavior, than it is about political structures. In other words, if you're trying to limit the corruption of policymakers, and you think that term limits is going to accomplish that, well, there's also an argument that those that are corrupt will just be corrupt faster. They'll move faster. They'll put things in place faster. The Electoral College is another issue. If you remove the Electoral College, one argument is that the smaller states will have less of a voice. Should the smaller states with less population have any more voice? That's an argument that has to be made. Maybe they should have a voice based on their population. The assumption there is that large states, because they have so many people, could mute the voices of those states that have smaller, populations, and that those states and the attention they get from the federal government gets reduced. Now, that would depend, I think the argument could be, well, it depends upon how many people in these small states vote for a particular candidate. In other words, the argument there, or an argument, could be that, well, there's fewer people there. But as I think we've seen in previous elections, the popular vote is often closer than the electoral, college vote, if you will, right? So it would seem an argument could be made that every state, regardless of how small they are in terms of population, those votes are needed, because to lose by 50,000 votes or 100,000 votes or 150 or 250 or a million votes, still, nevertheless, I think that may put politicians running for the presidency on shakier ground. You can't afford to give up those votes in the smaller states, because if you do, you may not win. That's an argument against the argument that you're going to diminish the voice of these smaller states. That could be true. California has a lot of people, but California alone is not going to be able to control the election, where it's a lot easier to control states and their electoral votes. That's an argument. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to start on commerce. I have to tell you that this gets very complicated, not in terms of the ideas, but what's occurred over time in the area of commerce, how commerce has been expanded, how it's been defined, and then what you do with it. Because everything, almost without exception, has a dollar associated with it, an amount of money, if you will. That being the case, it's in everybody's interest to sort of keep a close eye on that. In other words, the name of the game is commerce. In a capitalist society, commerce is the name of the game. So think about this. Before Amazon grew to be the mammoth it is today, if you used a credit card to purchase something from Amazon, say 10 years ago, the question became, should Amazon be collecting tax, state tax, and giving to those states those tax dollars? With brick and mortar, if you walk into a store in any state, even if you're a person from out of state, you have to pay state sales tax, unless there is no state sales tax. But you'd have to pay sales tax. Okay, what happens if a person living in that state purchases something from outside that state and it gets delivered to them in their home state? Should they be paying their state taxes? Should those entities that are shipping these goods, should they collect those taxes for states? And so that's been an issue, of contention. Obviously, Amazon was concerned that if we do that, we may lose, a fair amount of business. That's really not been the case. Or it creates another burden in terms of, resources and orchestrating it and collecting it and getting it to those states. The court has heard cases on that. And one of the sort of mindsets of the court is you're ordering it on your computer using your credit card. In a sense, that's the brick and mortars. In other words, in your house or wherever you are, in your car, sitting in a park with the laptop on your lap and ordering something off Amazon, that in essence is Amazon's brick and mortars. That's their store. Everywhere you are is Amazon's store. Therefore, if Amazon had a physical store, bricks and mortar, right, in a particular state, and you walked into that store, you would have to pay taxes. And those taxes would be collected by the Amazon in the Amazon store, and those monies go to the state government. So if we can make where you are, in essence, a store, you would have to pay taxes, even though you used your credit card, which was issued by a bank in another state, right, that you pay interest to on the credit card, and you do it, and you're buying from a company that is located in another state that somehow even though you're using a interstate means of purchasing it, the credit card, and even though there's no physical plant, there's no brick and mortar, right? There's no buildings that you're inside and purchasing from a salesperson in that building. The court has said, no, that's where you are, is their offices or their store. And using your credit card, even though some other bank gave it to you, is a means of payment. And therefore, the fact that it's traveling across state lines to get to you doesn't come into play in terms of collecting state taxes. Now, back up for a second. The federal government wants the states to have enough money to sort of run the operation. And the rationale there is simple. The federal government does want to take, the Congress does not want to take the taxes it collects, right, through tax and spending, and have to help the states out. They don't have enough money. We've got to assist them. They don't want to do that. So the more money states can make on their own, the less likely they are to come to the federal government. I would argue that they're going to come anyway. The thing about states is whatever they collect, they spend and more. And so if they can keep their budgets in line by getting the federal government to give them more money, which is why they send people to one of the reasons why they have representatives in Congress, in the House, and members in the Senate, bring home the cash or the bacon, as we say. That's an important thing. We spend less of our money. We spend the federal money, which is collected from all the other states. Think about that. If you're a small state, small population, and you need money from the federal government, you're getting dollars probably that exceed the dollars you're paying into in federal taxes. It's possible, right? And you're getting more money, which means you're getting money from those that are paying taxes outside your state. So they're supporting your state. Again, the court has said very clearly that doesn't matter. Congress can spend the money once they've collected in any way they wish. And there's no real limit on that. So again, necessary and proper is really determined by the Congress of the United States, not by some outside body. And it's not so clearly defined that there's no confusion. Okay, this brings us to the federal commerce power. I think you should probably have your mind around the necessary and proper issue. Again, there's going to be cases that you're going to get that explore all these issues, that demonstrate how the court views these various things like necessary and proper and the like. So the Commerce Clause. Initially, the idea, again, was that the federal government would keep states from sort of having a conflict. So there are two things. What if one state, there's a company there, and they're bringing their goods across state lines, let's say to get it to where there are ships. Most states are landlocked, right? Most states don't have access to waterways. And going back, to the founding, there were no planes. So the only way to get your product out was to use the waterways. And so states like New York and Virginia, those on the eastern seaboard and the west, more so on the east back in the beginning, obviously, could really control what those companies from other states had to pay to, sort of get to those waterways to get their goods out. Keep in mind, too, that states had different currencies. And so they could manipulate their currency so that you had to buy more of it to get less in terms of services and the like. So they could basically give advantage in the beginning to their own corporations, their own governing bodies. Their own corporations and the like, and basically discriminate against those companies that come from other states. This obviously causes conflict with so many states that were going to be landlocked, but more importantly, just to be able to do business. So places like New York could greatly affect the commerce in those states. So initially, it was really simple. If you cross state lines at all, any conflict, right? That's why in the Constitution, uniform currency is important. everyone's on the same currency and no one gets to manipulate it, of course, except the federal government. So you can keep people from going ahead and manipulating the market. The same thing happens internationally, by the way, now. Countries can control their currency. Most of them peg their currency to some, it used to be the gold standard and the US dollar. But places like China, countries like China, that do not peg their currency but can move it up and down, could make business, doing business there very attractive. And it could bring in a lot of money into their coffers. So they manipulate that. The idea of not allowing people to manipulate it is the same idea that happened way back when in the founding. That states, think of them as international, bodies, right? Other nations. They can manipulate just as China and others are doing today. And so that's problematic. So it made sense for the federal government to say, we're all going to get on the same money, so no state can control that. And we're also going to resolve conflicts between states or people in the states, other states, because we don't want conflict. We want the United States to stay united because we benefit from working with each other. Now, those state lines have become so blurred. You want to move, you move, right? You want to drive across state lines, you drive across state lines. There's really nothing impeding you, right? And the like. So keep in mind that what we had with the states being united was initially problems that we have in the international arena now in terms of commerce. The other issue here, generally speaking, is that it became very expensive to do business. When you went outside the states, because there were going to be other barriers to entry in other countries. One of the arguments way back when Japan became a major producer of automobiles, the U.S. pushed for to have our car companies here have greater access to the Japanese market. And the idea was, okay, we'll do that. But if you're shipping over American automobiles, you're going to have to ship them to a port in Japan that is smaller, and it takes longer to offload those cars. So if you're a Japanese citizen, you want to buy a car, what do you buy? The one that's coming from America that's going to take longer to get here and longer to get access to, or the one that's right here, the Japanese-made car that you can get today, pick up in 2 days. So there's ways of manipulating that. But the idea was that we wanted to keep states from having the ability to do that because that was corrosive. And so that's how it started. Keep in mind also that commerce was very simple back then. There wasn't the internet. Weren't planes. There weren't a lot of goods that had nothing to do with actually being physical goods. There were lots of services that did not have to be bound by state boundaries. And so as it became more complicated, the question became, what constitutes interstate commerce? If you're downloading an app or music or whatever from some company, there's nothing physically being moved, right? Digital exchange. So, and as we move to currency, right, we're moving Bitcoin in that direction, that sort of thing. That's going to change. Another bit of technology right now today, one of the arguments with companies like Google and Facebook and the like is that through government protection, they really can filter out the news people get. Now, that's one of the arguments. Well, do they have a right to do that? Should that be controlled? Is that got something to do with interstate commerce? So you'll see as we walk our way through this that interstate commerce has become everything in terms of any kind of commerce. So there's been such an expansion, and you'll see historically there's sort of a pivotal moment where the Supreme Court sort of says, okay, to the states, you spend and you deal with commerce in any way you want. We're going to back off that, dealing with cases that are involved in it. So what begins to happen is over time in small steps, because the expansion of the economy and the goods and services provided in the economy. Just think of cell phones. In order to call someone in another state or down the street, this thing, the signal gets beamed up, comes back down. It gets more complicated. So as a consequence, what you have eventually is you have these complications of what commerce is, what interstate is, and then it seems to fall more and more on the federal government and their ability to exercise their federal commerce power, which gets so expansive, again, that it gives the federal government a great deal of power to manipulate markets and businesses. We want to advance this business and not that business in terms of getting, entering into the market. So commerce has become more and more important, and we'll pick that up next time.